Well, hi everybody. It's Sandy Allnock in for Ellen Hutson with my Color All the Things with Sandy episode for this month. And I'm going to be talking about different coloring mediums, and I'm going to address 4 different ones. And this is mainly for people who kind of want to color, but they don't want to get started because it's a rabbit hole. And I'll just talk about the pros and cons of each one. Let's start with Copic markers because people see those. They're like, oh my gosh, I want to do that. Looks so beautiful. And I've got some Neenah paper ready, and I've got 3 colors that I picked out in all these different mediums to use. And I did swatch these out on these little tiny swatches, but I don't normally do that with my Copics. I did that just for this video, so it matches all the other mediums. And with Copic markers on the Neenah paper, I'm just going to use these 3 colors that are not part of a blending group. I'm going to play around with trying to blend one into another. And sometimes they go really easily like this because they're right next to each other on the color wheel. Sometimes, like with a green and an orange, it's a little nerve-wracking because you can go over that edge as many times as you want, and that orange is not going to have fun blending into the green. You can do things like create your own color by touching them tip to tip without ruining the marker. But often it's easier to just get a marker color that's going to be in between those colors, which then starts to grow your collection. And you have to buy a lot of markers, and they're expensive. And unless you're sure you really, really, really want to color and you want to dedicate the time and the money to do it, it's often overkill for a lot of people, and they give up on coloring at all, even if it looks pretty. So we're going to talk about some other ways to go. Watercolor is one of my other favorites. And that, again, is another thing that has a little bit of investment, but I personally think they're cost effective in the long run. So I have this book, and I bought the dot chart. And the dot chart, for me, I made all of these little swatches with each one of the colors, and I have notations on them and everything. I'll send you a video link in the doobly-doo so you can go watch how I did all this and why I did all this. If you're just starting, this is overkill. Don't do this. You can definitely paint from those dot cards, and that's a great way to get started and just see if you want to try watercolor. But don't go to this effort unless you're positive you really want to get into watercolor and really understand it a lot, because that's a lot of work. This is the colors that I have decided on, and I put them in my palette, and I just squeeze them out into little half pans. So you have to buy a palette, you have to buy the little pans, and you have to buy the tubes of paint. And that can feel expensive. There is a little set of 6 colors. There's 2 yellows, 2 reds, and 2 blues. And you can mix them to get so many colors. This is a little chart that I made, and again, there's a video of that, so I will put a link in the doobly-doo. And I looked at what that bright yellow looks like mixed with all the other colors in the set, and I did the same thing for each one. And look how many colors you get out of one set of 6 paints. You can use them on a plate. You don't even have to use a palette. So the investment in that is pretty limited. There's also these mini sets, and there's a bunch of different ones. This is the floral set, and it comes only with those 6 that I'm pointing to. The other ones are empty pans, so you can just buy a couple other colors to supplement what's in there, and you don't have to go buy a special palette for that. As far as paper, the cold press and the hot press are the ones I would recommend for newbies. The hot press is on the right, the cold press is here on the left. You can see there's a lot more texture in the cold press. I find that makes watercolor flow more, but for a couple of reasons that I'll share later on in this video, you might want to consider the hot press as well. Number 8 silver black velvet brush is what I recommend. If you're just going to get one brush, get a good one. If you get a brush that all the bristles fall out or it doesn't hold water and stuff, you're not going to have any success with your painting if you have a really terrible brush. Because I've tried that before and I was not happy with watercolor, and I didn't want to ever paint again because I bought a terrible brush, and then I discovered these and I went, oh my gosh, I can paint. The paint actually moves. So that's an important thing, and that's just a great brush that I can recommend. So I mixed up a couple puddles of paint from those 3 colors that match the little 3 that I'm testing in this whole video. And look what a big area I can cover right away, really quickly, with just a brush stroke and a little bit of paint. And I can just throw the colors on, let them blend together. When they're wet, they're going to blend nicely for the most part. And I have a whole bunch of classes on watercolor and talking about water management and pigment management and whether you have too much water or not enough water and all that. That's like overkill for this video. So I will let you think about taking a class if you want to really dive in and learn more. But for the most part, just do something simple like this with a big stamp. The bigger stamp you get for watercolor, the more fun it's going to be to just throw color in. I mixed in, with that orange, I mixed in a little red so that I could create a darker orange. And then I mixed up a little bit more pigment into my yellow mix so I have a more intense color. And with the green, I'll do the same thing. I'll add more of the green pigment, and that's going to make it thicker, and I'm going to have brighter color. So you can get bright color or you can get soft color with watercolor. With Copic markers, you'd have to actually buy a paler marker in order to get paler colors. In watercolor, you can just do that. This is the hot press paper. The other one was the cold press paper. And you can see the water does move. The watercolor and the paint do move across the surface. And I've got a really nice pale set of colors here because I'm using a lot of water and just a little bit of pigment in each one of the puddles of color. So you can get a variety of things out of one group of paints. So even if it seems like a big investment at the beginning, it lasts you a long time and you get a lot of variety that you can play with. So next up is going to be colored pencils. That's kind of the starter that I think of when somebody who doesn't know how to do any art, you just want to start with something. We're all used to using pencils. So I like both of these brands, the Polychromos and the Prisma, so much that I made hex charts for both, and they're over on my site. And the one big difference, the metallic pencils in the Prismacolor set are better, they're stronger, and they have neon colors. But for the most part, you can see both of them have plenty of color selection. The Prismacolor is 150, the Polychromos is 120. The papers that I'm going to test here are going to be the Nina that I used with the Copic markers and the hot press watercolor paper. Yes, I said watercolor paper for colored pencils. Each one of these, I'm going to do half the leaf in the Prismacolor, and that's going to be the left half, and the right half will be in the Polychromos, just so we can get a side-by-side. Now the Prismacolor are the ones that I've used for, let's just say a couple decades. Yeah, let's just call it that and not tell you how old I am. It was back in college days when I first started using those as a professional and did a bunch of illustration in them and that sort of thing. So I really do love these pencils. There are some people who have adamantly terrible experiences with them, and a lot of that comes from Prismacolors tend to have the possibility to break, but the breakage is usually because the box has been dropped. Sometimes it was dropped in shipping or dropped by your kids when they were carrying it around or something. Don't blame the pencils. Sometimes it's user problems as opposed to the pencils themselves. They're a wax-based pencil. The Polychromos are oil-based. But as far as the actual performance of the pencils, I can get the same results in both. So what I'm doing here is coloring a little heavier pencil until I get to the place where it crosses another color, and I'm layering it to get a blend going, and then I go with a little lighter stroke, and that way I get a blend. Now the one on the right that I'm showing now is the hot press, and you can see there's definitely a difference in texture. The Nina is not cotton paper. It's a synthetic paper. It's made actually for printing. It works really great with the Copic markers, and it works fairly well with pencils. But look at the difference in the kinds of soft blends I can get on a real cotton paper. And since you might want to be trying several mediums, the hot press watercolor paper works for a lot of them. So that's kind of a nice thing to straddle if you're trying to use a number of mediums and use one paper instead of having to buy a whole bunch. Because I like the one on the right better. It's got a little bit nicer blends to it because of the paper. Next, if you want to combine the ease of a colored pencil with the fun of watercolor, then you can try watercolor pencil. I have my watercolor pencils all swatched out the same way I do the watercolor, and I've got the Inktense here. These are ink pencils. They're not watercolor, but they work kind of the same, and I'll talk about some differences. They're very bright colors because they're ink, they're not watercolor. And then my other favorite brand though is Albrecht Dürer, and they're by Faber-Castell. They actually match the Polychromos colors. So the color sets are the same. This is the Albrecht Dürer full set of pencils, and you can see it's got a really nice variety of colors, and there's 120 in that. The 60 set, which is half of them, they do have a really nice mix. So if you want to just get started, this is what I do recommend for sure. The 60 set is great. The Inktense, the full set is 72, and then they have various combinations of pencils less than that. And they're brighter colors. I'm going to test these again on the hot and the cold press paper, and we're going to do Inktense on the left and the Albrecht Dürer on the right. Great thing about watercolor pencils is that you don't even have to color well because you can scribble. And when you scribble, you're just putting the pigment down on the paper that you're going to add water to, and then the water is what's going to move everything and blend it. So it's not really urgent to try to make your coloring really perfect. And again, it's a pencil. We're used to the motion of a pencil. So this is a really good place to start as well. If you want to kind of branch into watercolor, but you're not really sure, this is even a way to get toward watercolor if that's where you want to head eventually. You can also use these in combination with watercolor, do some background effects, and then for some of those delicate internal pieces, you can do something a little more controlled with watercolor pencil. So the Inktense is on the left, very intense in color. I have to work a little bit to get the color to break up on the surface of the paper with the water. And you're going to see how that plays into the difference as we go. The Inktense is ink, it's not watercolor, so it wants to kind of stay put a little bit more. It's a little more challenging to work with than a watercolor pencil. I rinsed my brush before I got to the green so that I don't contaminate the two anymore, because when you go back and forth, you can see how it sort of makes a brown because the colors are not next to each other in the color wheel, so they have some arguments. Let's just call it sibling rivalry. They can't decide who's in charge, so they make brown instead. But look at the quick strokes I can make with the Albrecht Dürer. I mean, it's just stroke, stroke, boom, boom. It moves the color and blends it very quickly. It melts out into watercolor much nicer than the Inktense does. It doesn't have that immediate bright color, and that for some people is not what they like, but it's still quite bright. It's just not as bright and as intense. So I'm going to do the same thing here on the hot press paper, and you can see the difference in the surface. It's a smoother paper, so you're going to see all those little lines as opposed to you saw a general texture in the other one. And with the Inktense pencils, watch how much better they do blend out. It's still work to do it, but you don't end up with all that little fussy texture on it. You end up with something a little bit smoother, and that's because of the paper. So again, another reason for hot press paper that just has different properties than the cold press. Frankly, I'm someone who loves an even rougher texture. There's a rough watercolor paper as well as a cold press and a hot press. That one is actually my real favorite, but that's because I have a lot of experience. It does take a little bit to know what that's going to do and how you have to adapt your work in order to work with that kind of paper. But it is a lot of fun. And the Albrecht Dürer on this paper works quite nicely as well, melts out really beautifully. Now to solve the question from those who want to see that brighter, more intense color, after it dries, I can put another layer of the Albrecht Dürer pencil on there, and I can rewater that. I can also rework if it dries poorly in some area. The Albrecht Dürer can re-wet, and I can fuss with it. I can try to work on an area that I needed better blending in. The Inktense pencil, once it's down, there is no moving it. I mean, there's a little moving it, I should say, but it does not want to move. So if you don't get your blending right, as soon as it's dry, you're done. And that's really all you can do with it. The Albrecht Dürer you can keep working on. You can see that orange section much brighter than the other because it has more pigment in it. So that is really the difference in trying to solve for that in getting that bright color. So there are 4 different ways that you can color, and you can choose what one is best for you. One final recommendation I'd like to make is for new colorists to focus on stamps that have a big, bold outline. These Mondo oak leaves are the kind of big outline that's going to keep you from having to worry about going out of the lines so much. Tiny stamps with thin outlines are a little more challenging and require a little more experience. So that's about it. I have tons more over on the blog, lots of written instructions and everything. So please go see that. And I will visit with you guys again next month. Bye-bye.